unprecedented. No developed Western country had defaulted in any way on government debts.
In the pantheon of financial crises, this is mammoth.
The euro can't fall apart. Surely everyone will understand.
Deciding to leave the European Union to go it alone.
And the order that has brought peace to a once war-torn continent may yet come apart.
Europe holds a unique place in the history of the world. Growing out of the grandeur of the Roman Empire and centuries of decline and darkness, modern Europe was able to slowly conquer the world, placing a tiny peninsula at the center of global culture, learning, and power. Europe reached its zenith in the 18 and 1900s, but was quickly brought back down to reality by deadly feudal world wars, economic depression, and physical destruction. After the Second World War, European dominance of the world was clearly over, and the once great nations had to forge a new path in a world dominated by rival superpowers. Slowly and definitely not unanimously, Europeans moved towards integration as they realized the best path forward was with each other.
An historic meeting takes place in Rome City Hall. Long a dream, the common European market takes its first step forward.
The common market lifted almost all trade restrictions between member states, furthering economic integration and making war between Europeans a distant possibility only a decade after the Second World War. Slowly, more countries joined. In 1973, Denmark, Britain, and Ireland joined. By 1986, Greece, Spain, and Portugal had joined an expanded project, now with open borders and freedom of movement between member states. The biggest change occurred in 1991.
Good evening. After months of debate and division, the government has finally ratified the Maastricht Treaty.
The Maastricht Treaty was the next step towards integration, creating the European Union of today. Its most significant step was the creation of a common currency for all of Europe, further economic unity that just years before would have been unthinkable. With some exceptions, the members of the EU adopted the new euro, and as the European Union continued to expand, so did the Eurozone. Applicant nations had to meet strict criteria on their economic health, hoping to prevent major issues, and there was strict oversight from the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. Nonetheless, the Eurozone quickly faced issues, many of which were considered inevitable. These troubles mainly stemmed from a fundamental weakness of the euro. Any currency needs a powerful state behind it to regulate its value and other aspects, which the decentralized European Union could not provide. The economic situations of Eurozone countries varied widely, but the central bank was forced to adopt one policy for everyone. Within just the first few years, it was clear that one size does not fit all. In the early 2000s, established Northern European countries had healthy, large economies but were growing slowly compared to the younger, rapidly growing economies of the South. The central bank chose to adopt low interest rates, hoping to incentivize investors in the North to lend money to the South. Poor governments like Greece were eager to borrow money at low interest rates, and investors were eager to lend money to them for several reasons. First, these countries were growing rapidly, and investors were eager to reap some profits of this explosive growth. Second, investing in these poor countries, which might seem risky in other scenarios, felt safe. The countries shared the same currency as countries like Germany or France, and investors felt that these stable nations wouldn't let someone in the Eurozone default, because that would hurt them too. Thus, investors were still pouring money into nations like Greece and Cyprus, even as public debt rose to over 80% of GDP. Although there were safeguards in the Maastricht Treaty to limit deficit spending like this, there was little enforcement and financial regulation was fragmented among the member states. This debt wasn't necessarily bad. After all, these countries were rapidly growing and had the support of richer countries, so it seemed like a pretty safe bet to continue to invest in them. This all changed in 2008.
This is going to be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points.
It's said that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold, and turmoil on Wall Street quickly spread to Europe. Governments needed money to bail out banks and other industries, but now as the continent entered into a recession, investors were much less willing to spend money. With little hope for private investment, it turned to international organizations to bail out these countries. In the end, after intense political fighting, the investors turned out to be right. The Eurozone wasn't willing to let one of its members default, and a collection of institutions, the Troika, consisting of the European Commission, European Central Bank, and International Monetary Fund, quickly produced much-needed bailout funds for Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, and Ireland. These institutions hoped their quick actions had diverted a crisis, but in reality, the crisis had just begun. The ensuing economic and political crisis would come to affect every part of the continent in many dramatic ways. However, it affected the richer countries of Europe much differently than the poorer countries, and its effects on both the people and governments. Nonetheless, there were still some constants across the continent, in the questioning of traditional institutions and Euroscepticism that outpoured from every region. To first investigate this disparity, we must first define what richer and poorer Europe is. For the purposes of this video, the richer countries are those in the dark green. Now let's begin comparing the effects of the crisis on the two sides of this divided Europe. First, we'll look at the effects on the people and government of the lighter green countries, and then compare those with the effects on darker green, finally looking at similarities between the experiences of both regions. Within the poorer countries of Europe, there are three countries that can serve as case studies for the effects of the crisis on the region as a whole: Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. Problems between Greece and the Eurozone had existed since its inception. In order to meet the strict criteria for joining the currency, Greek leaders had misrepresented the state of their economy, as bad figures were revised down to make it seem like the country was faring much better than it actually was. In 2009, the reality was exposed, and as Greece entered into a recession, the Troika was forced to help the country out. The measures they took had great effect on the Greek people and government. The bailout loans were conditional on Greece passing strict austerity measures, drastically cutting public spending and programs. These measures increased value-added tax, luxury and sin taxes, raised a new tax on company profits, reduced pensions, and cut pay for public employees. As the Greek people faced a recession and soaring unemployment, the measures were the last thing they wanted, and the country exploded into violent protests. As one demonstrator put it,
"The Greek wages compared to the expense of this country is a joke, you know. These people live on nothing."
Protests continued throughout 2010 as people in the street in Athens shouted slogans like IMF and EU out, showing the anger fermenting in the country against the institutions that imposed the austerity terms. As the situation in Greece never improved, protests exploded again in early 2011. This time, much of the anger was directed against the government, which was in crisis.
Shouldn't every farmer and every worker be able to make a living? The Constitution says all citizens are equal, so why don't our members of Parliament cut their own pensions instead of ours?
Anti-government sentiment was expressed in manifestos produced by popular assemblies across Greece, such as Syntagma Square, urging the Greek people to go on strike and promising further action until those who created the crisis leave Greece: the government, the Troika, banks, and more. Written as a starting argument to the Greek people, the manifesto wanted to express the most extreme arguments of the people, likely influencing its rhetoric and arguments. Anger was shown even more dramatically in the snap election of 2011, where the two main political parties who had ruled Greece for 40 years collapsed as voters punished them for supporting the austerity measures. The popularity of the ruling party dropped from 43 to 7%, as radical right and left-wing parties who voted against the measures swept into power. There was no question about how badly the crisis rocked the government and politics in Greece. The events in Greece were the most dramatic across all of Europe, but less extreme examples are representative of the effects across poorer Europe. Ireland experienced an economic crash as the value of property, rising to extreme levels, burst, and the government was forced to prop up the banks that had financed the bubble. As the economy collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed to 14%, and the national budget fell from a surplus in 2007 to a 32% deficit in 2008. All of this had great effect on the Irish people. Although the country didn't explode into protests like Greece, in many ways the situation of the Irish was worse.
Maybe this is again part of the Irish psyche, that there's this sort of resignation, this learned helplessness that has set in, that we are now in this situation and there's nothing much we can do about it except put up with the misery.
This quote must be understood in its historical context. The history of the Irish people has been very hard, from man-made famines to guerrilla warfare, which contributed to the learned helplessness expressed by the reporter. Another philanthropist who ran a prominent Irish charity service during the crisis recounts,
We have people phoning up who are on the brink of ending their lives because they see no hope. The house is going to be repossessed, their car is being repossessed, they're losing their jobs.
The government also fared poorly as the Prime Minister resigned and his parliament collapsed. Portugal in turn saw its housing market collapse and the government lose its ability to pay back debt, requiring bailout loans from the Troika. The Prime Minister and his government resigned, and the crisis hurt the people hard.
There have been lots of cuts, especially for the poor. They're hit the hardest. That's not fair. But none of us will be doing well.
Scenes of despair amid the economic depression could be seen in every country across southern and eastern Europe. This despondency wasn't seen across the entire continent, however.
Europe's divide is about competitiveness. Portugal's economy is like this tram, chugging along at a sluggish pace. It simply can't compete with the sleeker, more modern economies that it's bound together in the euro with.
The sleeker, more modern economies mentioned in the news report experienced the European recession in a much different manner than the poorer countries described above. Obviously, the recession and debt crisis negatively affect the people, shown in rising unemployment and a decline in GDP, but the extent to which this occurred were much less than in the countries previously discussed. The effects of the crisis on the governments and people of richer Europe were profoundly different. These graphs show satisfaction with democracy and national governments in various regions of Europe, with the dark blue roughly corresponding to poorer countries and the green to the richer. This shows how public trust in the government remained mostly constant from 2002 to 2012 among the richer countries, but dropped very sharply among the poorer countries. Although there were some exceptions, for example an early election in the Netherlands and the French president losing his bid for a second term, for the most part the governments of the richer countries of Europe avoided the crises and volatility that befell their southern neighbors. As governments toppled across southern Europe, the situation in Germany, for example, couldn't be more different.
Unlike many European leaders, Angela Merkel currently has reason to smile. She's Germany's most popular politician, with 60% approval ratings.
Additionally, all of these countries were confident in their institutions, as expressed by the governor of the Central Bank of France.
The exposure of the French banks to peripheral sovereign debt is 60 billion in general. It's only a small fraction or limited fraction of their own funds.
Knowing that his audience would be the French and broader European public, he likely wanted to ease their minds and make him and his government look smart and capable of managing the crisis, which might have influenced his presentation of the facts. Nonetheless, it's clear that the governments of richer Europe would make it through the crisis. But what about the people? As one might expect, the people of richer Europe fared much better than those in the poorer countries. Unemployment rose and some governments were forced to adopt limited austerity measures, but these were much less burdensome than what was imposed on Greece and Portugal, for example. Interviewed in Frankfurt in the middle of the crisis, one German man argued,
People like us barely understand what it's about. Rescue package, leverage, no idea. But in the end it looks like this. We work and pay, and the others restructure.
Since the beginning of European integration, Germany has paid more to the EU than they got from it, likely contributing to this man's anger to the Greeks. However, it also shows his separation from the crisis and how it barely touched his daily life. Several others from England and Germany didn't seem worried at all about the crisis.
As an Englishman, it's fine. We don't have the euro.
I'm a goldsmith. I have my money in gold, platinum, and diamonds. It's so safe, it's wonderful. I don't worry about the euro very much.
In fact, the people of richer European nations like the United Kingdom were so detached that they could even make jokes and skits about the crises that were hurting the lives of millions in the South. Combined, these interviews and videos show that the Eurozone crisis that so greatly affected the people of Ireland, Greece, and Portugal touched those in richer Europe much, much less. However, despite these great differences, there were still some limited similarities across the entire continent. The most obvious effect that was felt across the continent was the increase in Euroscepticism and distrust of international organizations in other countries. The European debt crisis exposed the fundamental weakness of the euro mentioned above that most people were unaware of before. In the years following the crisis, journalists and pundits speculated that the euro was about to collapse, like this article from 2012 calling the currency's failure the inevitable consequence of imposing a single currency on a very heterogeneous group of countries. Compared with other non-Eurozone members like Iceland or Sweden, the recovery of the Eurozone was much slower and made people even more unsupportive. Many across Europe questioned the European Union in the best of times, and in the worst of times, the divisions and skepticism quickly grew. Divisions between different parts of Europe were expressed in the thoughts of people across the continent. This German, for example, described the Greeks in this clip.
Also ich bin nicht dafür, dass die Griechen überhaupt Geld bekommen. Die streiken alles kaputt, verbrennen die deutsche Fahne und tun mit Nazi-Parolen die über uns her sind. Und das finde ich nicht. Die sollen mal ihre Arbeit machen und nicht alles kaputt machen. Wir haben jetzt wieder.
The feeling was reciprocal.
Many people in Greece, exhausted by years of austerity and recession, blame the German government for forcing more belt.
The possibility of Greece leaving the EU, or at least the Eurozone, was very present as these divisions fermented. Meanwhile, Euroscepticism rose in all corners of the continent. In the years after the Eurozone crisis, anti-EU sentiment could be found in every member state. Obviously, the most extreme example of this occurred in Britain.
Is projecting that the UK has voted out and to withdraw from the European Union after more than...
But this pattern can be seen across the continent. On the streets of Greece, one man expresses anger with the institutions.
The European Union is responsible for the acute humanitarian and social crisis in Greece.
In France,
our people demand one policy only, a policy of the French, for the French and with the French.
And in other countries.
That might be the first step for Denmark to leave the European Union.
It took the sovereignty of the Netherlands away. Commissioners are in charge now that nobody in the Netherlands knows.
Es el sistema que han creado. Esto es una gran mafia. Europa es una gran mafia. Y tú has caído en la trampa.
The people of Europe brought this anger to the polls too. In 2009, parliamentary elections saw anti-European parties with virtually no support. A decade later, they were winning double-digit percentages of the vote in several countries, shown in this graphic. Populist, anti-European leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban won a majority. There's no question that the devastation of 2008 and the European debt crisis were key elements in fueling this. The European debt crisis transformed the very nature of the European Union and presents many questions for the future of the bloc. Many of these are still unresolved, and the long-term effects of this crisis and its position as a turning point for the organization may still be decades away from answer. The crisis had far-reaching effects on the lives of people of Europe and governments across the continent, which varied greatly from region to region. Since the devastation of World War II, Europe has been on a slow march towards integration and unity, but this past decade has presented the greatest, most dangerous challenge towards this progression. Only time will tell how Europe responds to this crisis. Separation and division as nationalist parties rise to even further heights, or more unity as the necessity of further control over currency and other issues like migration and the current pandemic become more pressing. In any case, the European debt crisis will be looked back on as a turning point in European and global history.